Hi there, and welcome to Flip the Script Season 3 in the Weeds, Episode 10, BANT, the 4-letter word in sales. My name is Becc. I'm going to be your guide for today's session. If you do me a favor, if you would go to flipthescript.co first before you watch this session, if you'd click on Free Sales Training Hub on the left, Season 3 underneath in the menu, and then go to Episode 10 and download the deck. We have a very, very meaty session with a lot of different texts in there, so I want to make sure that you have it so you can follow along at each step of the way. So it's free. All it requires is your email so that you can have it right there in front of you. So once you've done that, let's go ahead and jump into the content. So we are going to lead with this agenda. Number 1, what is BANT good for? It is good for something. What is BANT good for? Number 2, what is it not good for? Then we're going to transition into, for inbound and outbound, different processes that you can use instead for qualifying. So we're going to go into 5 myths about qualifying inbound leads, and then a 7-step process in terms of how to qualify inbound leads instead that should drive 70% more conversion on a side note. And then we're going to go into, for outbound qualification, how do you qualify via outbound instead of BANT, asking them BANT questions. And then we'll leave with the impacts, and ramifications of all of the 5 myths being deployed within BANT. So we're going to go BANT, 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 BANT from front to end. So first, let's lead with what BANT is good for. So BANT, from my perspective, is good for an objective pool of data to keep in the back of your mind that will likely drive or indicators of a higher likelihood of sale. So I'm certainly not here to challenge that it's important, or it's something to think about if you have the authority within the room, if you have the person has budget available, if you believe that they have a need or a timeline. But this should be objective criteria to keep in the back of your mind. And even within the criteria itself, I would add a couple of things. So BANT is good for things to think about within the deal to keep cognizant of. What BANT, so these are the 4 questions in terms of what BANT is after. So it's, again, budget, authority, need, and timeline. So in white are the questions that are how they're typically asked, or what people, the information they're after. The ones that I would add in here are the ones in yellow. So B is, does the prospect have budget available or pre-allocated to this item? So I'm going to stress, I cannot tell you how many items I have bought that I didn't have a pre-allocated budget for because I didn't know that I had that problem. Is the authority. Does the prospect have authority, or do I have access to the decision maker somewhere in the cycle? Again, good question to keep in the back of your mind, but not to ask someone up front. The N is for need. Is there a need? Is there a need that they realize that they have? What I would add in there in the yellow, or is there a need that I have surfaced as the expert, not in terms of my expert of my product, but expert in terms of their persona? Is there a problem that they have that I would solve for that they've agreed to change? So I'd add that in for the N for the need. And then for the T, usually people are after what's the timeline they mentioned. I would transition that to, or I would reposition that to, what's the timeline as the seller based on the information that you heard within discovery that should be the timeline based on what you heard to solve the problem on the urgency, the impact, level of impact, and their current state. So again, the yellow are the things that I would add in even to these questions. The white is what's usually typically asked. But again, this is good for objective information to keep in the back of your mind that could likely cause mean that you're more likely to close the deal. What BANT is not good for, which is typically how I see it used most often, is BANT is used as a list of questions that people ask their prospects to see if they're worth having a meeting with, or information that they use to disqualify a prospect. So people say, do you have budget? Do you have a need? Are you the authority? Are you, what is your timeline? From my perspective, the seller's job is to understand if there's a need and what the timeline should be, based on the requisite, what problem they have and the level of that problem. So this should not be used to ask your prospect to disqualify them or qualify them from coming into a meeting. So this is usually how I see it asked. It is absolutely paralyzing for your prospects, causes an unbelievable amount of churn that we're going to get into in a second. But this is how I most commonly see it used. So I give always run the risk of giving a dating analogy, but I'm going to go ahead and throw roll the dice and put one out there. BANT questions are kind of like walking up to a first date and saying, do you want to get married? How many kids do you want to have? Are you a commitment phobe, or are you in a place in your life where you're ready to commit? Are you financially and emotionally stable? All valuable information to keep in the back of your mind, but should not be asked on the first date. Why? You'll scare them away. You won't get the right answers anyway, and you'll scare them away. So it's good information to be after, but not or to think about, but not information to ask via question to disqualify them from going on a quote unquote first date with you. So I'm going to go into the myths about inbound leads and go into a new qualification process that will get you the same information that you're after and actually drive much more conversion and enhance the buyer's journey along the way. So first, let's start with the myths. So the myth number one about inbound leads is going to be that you should round robin your hand raisers to SDRs. The reasoning is people think that the most valuable leads come in via inbound, so I should round robin them to my SDRs so they pay a lot of attention to them. Myth number two is going to be that I should reach out to my hand raisers in under 5 minutes because this will drive maximum conversion. And the research or the reasoning behind this is that studies show that you should reach out to them very, very quickly. Again, these are myths. Then I'm going to cover a process that squashes all of these. The third myth is that you should ask hand raisers qualifying questions to avoid passing unqualified meetings to the AEs. So the reasoning is that we want to make sure that we don't waste our time with the account executives with hand raisers that aren't quote unquote qualified. So this is why qualifying questions, BANT questions being included, are asked to prospects. Myth number 4 is going to be that you should ask BANT questions dead on to your hand raisers and that this should be a qualifying metric. So again, the impacts are very, very heavy and we'll go into them in the back end. But myth number 5 is that prospects don't know that you're qualifying them whenever you're doing it. That they're not aware. If you just use soft pedal language like, I'm going to better gear your demo, or I'm going to better gear your product experience by asking you these questions on if you're the authority, which makes zero sense at all, and that your prospects don't know what you're doing when you're doing it. So I'm going to go into a 7-step process of how you can still quote unquote qualify these inbound leads, but enhance the buyer journey, quicken the buyer journey, and drive on average 70% more conversion with this new qualification process that is not inclusive of BANT. So step number 1 is I would ask my prospects for a business email, and I would require a business email to avoid people that want to put in their personal email. So a lot of times marketers I will see them allow people to put in their personal or their Gmail, and then they'll disqualify that anyone who puts in their Gmail address isn't qualified to talk to. I'm like, let me be very clear. Mark Benioff has a personal email address. So does Jack Dorsey. So does Elon Musk. So does everyone. It has no correlation to the person's qualification or if they're valuable for you to talk to. All it has correlation to is that this group of prospects didn't want to give you their business email address, right? So I would require it at the gate so you can avoid collecting the Gmails. And I'm going to give you some steps and step side tips, but I would make it look, pretty easy. So I would put something like want to check it out, or get started, and they just require business email address. This should actually, a lot of marketers are scared at this point that it will cause a decrease in people putting in their email address if you require business. And I would argue actually the latter. So essentially, even though you're requiring your business email address, what will happen is your overall addresses might go down a little bit. They don't, in my experience. They might go down a little bit, but what you are collecting now is overall more business email addresses than you would if you were allowing them to put in their personal. So let's say that you had 100, typically 50 will be personal email addresses, 50 will be business-related addresses. Even though you only collected 75, let's say, with this latter process of requiring a business email, they're all business email. So net, you went from 50 to 75 in terms of business email, and you're disqualifying the personal email addresses anyway. But that's the first piece. The second piece is if you make it look easy, if you just say want to check it out and they think they just have to put their email address in, usually increases the amount of people that will request to talk to you about your product. So that's step one. The step one options, if you really are scared, that basically you'll see some drop, then you can put in a requirement, but basically with an option that if they put in a personal email address and it gets bounced back, then you can put in a basically a little box that says, whoops, we require a personal business email address. Do you want to email an SDR? And at that point, it can hyperlink to where they can email the SDR and let them know hey, I actually am a real person. I want to talk to you about your product, but I only have this business or I only have this personal Gmail address for whatever reason. So that will help you avoid any kind of churn. I will say, if you go to my website, for instance, I require a business email address and I enable this type of process. And I think I've gotten 3 emails over the last year and a half of people saying oh, I want to view this content, but I don't have a business email address. Also, if you want to avoid prospect churn, you'll be gating their email upon entry. So I will say, for anyone who's scared, that if you ask them any type of questions that you will get prospect churn, we're going to gate their email there. So as soon as they put in their business email, we're going to gate it at that point. So step 2 would be, I would have a quick and pain-free qualifying process. So essentially, once they put in their business email address, you want to expand it to a longer form and just ask them for the questions that you would need to ask them to make sure they're quote unquote qualified. Employee size, prospect role, level, integration stack. And I would have an optional field at the bottom that says that for things they'd like to cover or context that they'd like to cover. So my tip would be fewer fields, the better. But I would, whatever questions your SDRs are asking on the qualifying calls, I would just have them ask them in this form. Usually what you'll find with SDRs is when you dig through those calls, they're all asking different questions. They're all very, very subjective questions. So this is a quick and easy way, and I would go fewer fields the better that prevent your AEs from selling into them. But if you want to go, level, size of the company or size of the role, level of the role, etc. And then I would give an optional box for things they like to cover if they want to include a narrative. So my tip would be fewer fields the better. So for this option, you can even have at the top a want to talk to an SDR button that, or want to talk to an actual person. And so if they don't want to fill out that longer form, then they can click that and they can schedule using Chili Piper, wonderful tool. For the value that it is, I think it's one of the most underrated tools in tech. But essentially via Chili Piper, they would just click want to talk to an SDR and it would route to their calendar. So another option is you can backfill the data for them even. So using a tool like Clearbit, you could even, throw in the data of that it would automatically fill in of looks like you're at a team of 80, and you're the director of business development. And, that's your title and role, and this is your company. Did we get that right? So you can even make it faster for your prospects to just either confirm or they'll update you on what's truly correct. You can even pull tech stack. So if you use Crunchbase, they have access to a tool that I actually got to be a part of, which is G2 Stack. So it's under the brand G2, but it surfaces what tech stack that people have and for free that you can automate in there. So this is a way to back enrich that data to make it even easier on your prospects. So in this case scenario, if you do have the backfill data, then once they confirm if they're qualified and owned by an AE, meaning they hit the right answers and the account's owned by an AE, you can use Chili Piper to route straight to the AE calendar. No muss, no fuss, no SDR calling them, no, appointment, 15 minutes asking them BANT questions. You already asked them all the questions you need to know. So I'd gate them through, straight through for a 30-minute discovery. If they're qualified and not owned by an AE, then you can fill to the next AE in rotation, just to make all the piles equal using Chili Piper. And if they're unqualified, you can do one of two things. You can either route them to the calendar of an SDR to double check that they're truly unqualified, they're too small, etc. Or you can send them directly to a bi-weekly product webinar. So we're going to get into what that is a little bit in a couple of slides. Essentially, this is a webinar where you're going to demo the product at mass for all the quote unquote unqualified. So point being, in these three cases, you can use Chili Piper once they've clicked on the button to route accordingly. So for these options for the extended form, again, you can backfill all of this data, and you can even have the button at the top of, do they want to talk to the SDR? And this should not only enrich that your prospects are encouraged to fill out the form, but if they don't want to fill out a form and they just want to talk to someone and want to get qualified, then you can route them through. So sometimes I've even put language like, so you don't have to talk to an SDR, annoying SDR, would you answer the following questions? And usually people take it in jest and love the process. So step 3, this is going to be the routing for the prospects who fill out that extended form. So, and are qualified based on the input. So essentially at this point, someone's put in their business email address. It's extended to the longer form. They've answered those questions. They were either backfilled and confirmed, or they answer the question themselves with the drop-down menu. They click send it, of submit, and they were qualified. They were the right company size. They were the right title. They were the right, person you want to talk to. So in this case scenario, again, if it's qualified and owned by an AE, they just route straight to the AE's calendar. Ta-da, you just trimmed out a bunch of different steps. You don't have to ask him any questions. You don't, and you got the data that you needed. If they're qualified but not owned by an AE, so a lot of times, AEs will only have a certain amount of TAM, but there are people who still hit the employee size and title, but they're outside of TAM. So in that case scenario, I would send them around round robin to the AEs to make all of the calendars equal. So if I'm an AE and I own 50 accounts, and the next AE owns 50 accounts and 2 demos come in for the first rep and nothing comes in for the second rep, you can make them equal by taking all of the accounts that were qualified and people that were qualified but weren't owned and sending them both to the second rep. So Chili Piper makes this very easy, very painless, and then you can even solve the problem of AEs saying we don't have equal demos. Kind of a side step for this, if you want to, again, ensure that they all have an even demo pot, then even if I would allow my AEs to have a very limited amount of accounts. If a hand raiser comes in, it goes towards them. But then I would round robin all the unowned hand raisers, and you can even round robin outbound demos that are set, so that essentially all of your AEs have equal piles. An option that you can even, if you want to get more aggressive, so you can do a points-based system within Chili Piper of like maybe an enterprise company is worth 3 points and SMB is worth 1. So that you don't have one rep getting an appointment with LinkedIn and then someone getting an appointment with a mom and pop shop. So all appointments aren't created equally. I think we all know that within sales. So if you do want to instigate a points created based system, that's what I did within Chili Piper. And all of a sudden, now you don't have AEs who want to own a massive amount of accounts because it dictates the type of account, but not the volume of demos that they get, but also, this will evaporate overnight the problem of I have a better SDR, or I'm not getting equal support, so on and so forth. So step 4, this is going to be for people who put in their business email address, filled out the longer form, and they weren't qualified. If they're unqualified, then you can do one of two things, but I would say the most likely case scenario is you send them to a bi-weekly product webinar. We're going to get into what the webinar is in a minute, but if If it were me, there is a process that you can do that if they're unqualified, they filled out those fields and they're unqualified, you can route them to schedule time with an SDR for 15 minutes where the SDR double checks that they're unqualified. And before you send me a couple of emails saying that's way too detailed, hear me out. I have talked to over the last month a prospect that looked like they worked at one of the best companies that I could potentially work with in my career, and they didn't work there anymore. They had left 6 months ago. I have also talked to someone who looked unqualified, but actually was about to start at a very mega org that is a great prospect, or was a great prospective company. They're now a client of mine. They're one of my biggest clients. And the reason that I got that is because I didn't disqualify them. So I had a short 10, 15-minute call just to double check that they were at this team that looks truly unqualified. I would like that double check because you never know. And the impact of if I had not taken that 10 to 15-minute calls, I would say this person's unqualified. And then the person, I would not get the opportunity to work with one of my best and biggest clients so far. So point being, if you want to have your SDRs double check, they fill out those fields and they're unqualified, you can route them to the SDR for a 10 to 15-minute call where they're setting it up themselves. The SDR can just double check that information. If they truly are unqualified, they can send them to the biweekly product webinar. And if they are qualified, then they can manually set it up with, if they're owned by an AE, with the AE who owns it. And if they're not owned by an AE, they can still use Chili Piper to round robin and make the piles equal. The side note for this step is for people who, for the prospects who fill out the extended form and are unqualified, you can have them skip the SDR step and just route straight to the biweekly product webinar. Again, you're going to run the risk that some people look unqualified, but aren't, but actually are qualified. But if you want to run that risk for a speed's sake, then you can just send them straight to the biweekly product webinar where they can opt in, and they can sign in there. Step 5. So this is the process of the biweekly product webinar. So the biweekly product webinar is a webinar that I would host where you are basically demoing, quote unquote, one-to-many. And this is, I usually would pick a senior SDR that would run a product demo that's centered on the most common buyer persona within the room. So I'd have my reps basically scour through and say, okay, I have 50 people on this line and 28 of them are VPs of sales. So I'm going to make the demo cater to a VP of sales and the value that they would get. And at the end of the webinar, I had my SDR say, anyone who's interested in pricing can email me here. And the impact of that is typically we would surface 3 to 4 deals even out of people who looked unqualified. So it's bizarre to me that people will do all this, effort to try to get someone to request a demo, and then they try to request one and see your product and it's like, oh, you're not good enough. You're not big enough. Your role's not good enough. And there's no option for them to see it. So I would give them an option that makes them feel valued to see it. I would very heavily argue that and this is based on Keenan's work over at Gap Selling. He wrote that book. I would pick up a copy if you haven't. But essentially, someone's going to buy based on the size of their problem. So I've had some clients that look unqualified, but they have, quote unquote, the budget. More so, they had the problem that was so aggressive that they're like, I'll buy this, even though they were, quote unquote, outside of TAM. So usually when I work with orgs and I say, what's your TAM definition? And they're like, VP level and above or whatever it is. And I ask them questions of why. I'm like, so what data, makes you think that a VP meeting is causes more conversion than a manager? And they'll usually say, well, we don't have that data. Then I'm like, then how did you set that bar? So point being, I would have this webinar as a catch-all, if nothing else, to deliver on what you promised to your prospects, give them a demo, let them get to know you. And on a side note, you'll surface some deals out of it, at least in my experience. There's a couple different options for the contracts that you can do. One that I suggest, one that I heavily do not suggest, but I'll put it up here as an option. The first one is you can train the SDR on how to do the contract. So again, I would pick an aspiring SDR who wants to be an account executive And I would train them on how to do contracts so they feel empowered and they close these deals themselves. So this option, again, these were unqualified. So I want to warn, double asterisk mark, and like time out for a second. You will get kickback for this process. AEs will be like, that's not their job, or, like they shouldn't be selling. And it's like, time out. These were people that y'all didn't want to sell. Yes? These are people that you said, don't send me the meeting. They're not worth it. So what do you care? What do you care? This is just a pool, and I'd pick one person to do it. And then if they close the deals, which inherently they will, I would give all that commission to the SDR. So usually what this causes is a little bit of accountability on the AE team, that they're like, no, this is my toy. It's like, if you're not going to use the toy, man, then like, we're going to give it to the next kid kind of thing. So the second option is you could have the SDR send it to an AE and collaborate with them on it, split the commission in option 2, but I would not suggest that. The AE did nothing in that case. Not only did they not demo them, not only did they not sell them, like they're coming in the last minute, putting together a contract, which usually the SDR does, then they're getting commission on it. So I'm very a results-driven efficacy girl. I was thinking about this when I was running this morning. I'm like, man, I am, for better or for worse, I made a turn where I'm like, I want to be accountable to my results and held accountable to my results and results driven, that it's not a theory, that it's like, what did it cause type of thing. So in this case scenario, I would go with option 1, but both options are on the slide. And then step 6, this is the routing for the prospects who attend a 15-minute SDR call. So essentially there'll be 2 places where they can do this. People who hit the button when they said extended to the longer form, they put in their business email, extended to the longer form, and there was a button at the top that said talk to an SDR, or the prospects who filled out the longer form, but they were unqualified and they routed straight to the SDR. Straight to the SDR's calendar. In this meeting, I would have the SDR, again, double confirming that they're unqualified or seeing if they're unqualified or not for the first option. And if they're qualified and owned by an AE, they manually put on time. Qualified and unowned by an AE, then I would have them round robin within Chili Piper. And if they're unqualified, I would have them send to the biweekly product webinar. If they are unqualified, kind of a side note here, they're unqualified based on something that makes them not able to buy you, not just not likely to buy you. I would argue integrity to tell them that up front. Like, hey, you can still go see the product, but, let's say a piece of tech stack, for instance, of like, you don't have this piece of tech stack, they don't have, let's say a CRM, and you need that to hook into. I'd make them aware and say like, hey, it's actually contingent on you having a CRM, but here's the option that you can see the product. So sometimes people are in the evaluative process or about to purchase a CRM. So I would give them that as a warning of like, you need a CRM, for us to be able to integrate to, but I'll give you this option, either way, so you can go and take a look and take their word from there. So I would give them that tip just so that they're aware whenever they go about it. So the components of the new SDR role that I go into in this side step is basically the components that they're going to run into is number 1. So I had a lot of teams be like, well, what do I use my inbound SDR team for? I'm like, well, you need a lot less of them now, which is great. Make them outbound so you can drive up more pipeline. But number 1, they'll be running a sequence, whatever sequence you're running beforehand, all the emails and calls to all the people who put in their business email but didn't fill out the extended form. Those are the people I would have them run their sequence on. But you want to give them the option. They can schedule on the spot. And number 2 is they would attend all the 15-minute meetings that were scheduled with them, either when someone said they want to talk to an SDR or they were unqualified and you wanted to double check. They would attend those and see if the person's qualified and route accordingly. Number 3, you could have this person run the biweekly product webinar. And number 4, execute on the contract. So I will say, again, in my experience, not only is this going to drive 70% more conversion of your inbound prospects, they're going to feel better because of it, and it will drill down the amount of headcount that you need to do this process as well, because you're taking out the manual step. So very, very positive thing from my perspective of you can take those reps and take them and reallocate them to outbound. So I was always thinking as a leader, how do I optimize with all of these pieces to drive the most conversion with the least amount of people, right? So this will, as a side note, you will typically, I mean, I took a team of 10 down to a team of 1, arguably 2 in some case scenarios, of the people that they need, because again, I'm removing that manual step for your prospect's sake, and their buyer journey's sake and your conversion sake in tandem. So step number 7 here, this is going to be the follow-up process for people who gated, meaning they put in their business email, but they didn't fill out the extended form. So essentially what I would do is you can either have this manual, but anything that's manual that doesn't need to be manual, I would automate. So if you can kick these people, I would say after, give them whatever, an hour or 2 to fill out the extended form. Anyone who doesn't but gated their email, I would automate through to a sequence. And I would have this in the hand raiser sequence that your inbound SDR starting to run the sequence against. So a lot of people get nervous at a new process like this. And I'm like, well, here's the thing, guys. Worst case scenario, you're running the same exact process you were beforehand. Worst case scenario, if everything breaks. Best case scenario, most case scenario, you're driving a lot more conversion. So, you upload the prospects into a sequence. My recommendations for the sequence is you use all channels. I'd make the aggression in terms of the timing of it more aggressive at the back end of the sequence of how many steps that you do, but I would do the aggression on how quickly you do the timing more aggressive on the front end off of the trigger that they put in their email. I would do the infrastructure of 5 emails, 8 calls without voicemails, and 2 calls with voicemails. And I would tier the leads based on the quality of the size of account and their role. So something very overt. Here's a couple of options for step 7, but I would base the KPI system for this inbound rep on speed to lead. And I would have them measure out of the the prospects who were qualified, what percentage did they get into a meeting? And by not qualified, it means that they either have to have an overt indicator that they don't hit team size, or they talked to them and they said some type of certain thing. So you want to be very careful about not measuring them on overall volume, because then when the volume spikes up for marketing, they think they're the king or queen of sales development. When the volume spikes down, they think they're the worst. So, if the volume spikes up of demo requests, the BDR isn't any better. Way to go, marketing. That's marketing's work. Way to go, marketing. Way to go. And we're attributing that to a BDR and then paying them out because of it, which is absolutely bizarre to me. But another conversation for another time. But the impact of this is the comp won't go down if the demo requests go down, and won't go up if the demo requests are up. So I cannot tell you the amount of teams that I talk to where the inbound reps are killing it. And it's like, well, they're a calendar tool. Why not just use a calendar tool? And it's no disrespect to the rep. It's like the skill here, if anything, is speed to lead. But I would argue, and then the outbound reps, they only, get a few meetings per month. And they're like, oh, well, the outbound team doesn't know how to do their job. It's like, there's no difference in skill level necessarily here. Usually there's not. Usually the outbound team is more skilled. But if you aren't KPIing on the right things, you'll usually see a lot of team churn, angst, people changing companies because of it. I would argue that Flip the Script, I started it because of an issue like this. It was very deep to the infrastructure. So I'd watch out what you KPI. So that's the process for inbound. No more BANT, s'il vous plaît. No more BANT. For outbound, how I'd qualify, very simple. I would identify the overt criteria that you are looking for that an SDR can tell ahead of time that you deem as qualified. And then they have to book a meeting with a person within that criteria. Bada bing. In no case scenario would I ask a person after I said, Keenan, talk to me, Keenan, talk to me, Keenan, talk to me, 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 talk to me. And he's like, fine. And you're like, before you do though, are you the right person? Do you have money hypothetically? Do you have a need? It's bizarre. I'd pick the criteria that you think is qualified and then have your SDR team or prospecting team, full cycle AEs, go after that criteria. If they don't hit it, they weren't qualified. If they do hit it, they were qualified. So in no case scenario do I think it's a good idea to ever, and I mean ever, believe me when I say it, I mean ever, ask your outbound prospects BANT questions after they've agreed to a discovery meeting to qualify if they're worth it for a discovery meeting. What's the user journey there? Keenan, talk to me. Okay, fine. Okay, are you the decision maker first? Screw you. Even if he says like, no, I'm not, then it's like, okay, we actually don't want to talk to you, even though I just asked you 70 times. Bizarre. Make him feel not good enough, super messy, damages your brand, very impactful. So I want to close out with the paralyzing ramifications and impacts of a BANT process and of these 5 myths in general, and then we will close out for the day. Ramifications of myth 1. So myth 1 was that I should round robin all of these leads to the BDRs because they're our highest net leads. The ramifications, number 1, it delivers an inconsistent buyer journey. Number 2, and probably most importantly, it evaporates the transparency on who the best BDR is. They have no regard or they have no control over what quality comes around to them and when. It's an unfair distribution of leads, and it attributes the work of marketing to SDRs. So way to go marketing, not way to go SDRs if they have a great demo, someone who requests a demo. Ramifications of myth 2, even though myth 2 as a reminder was that a 5-minute SLA after someone requests a demo or become a hand raiser is what we should optimize for. Number 1, 5 minutes is fast to us. It's not fast to them. They want to schedule then. We live in a now society. You could miss out on time-intensive opportunities. So your prospects, when they're in the I need to buy now, like they have evaluated a lot of criteria. So studies show, and I put this as 0.5, that the majority of a purchasing decision is based off of how quickly and who gets back to them first. How good is their buyer journey, right? So if we're waiting any amount of time, our prospects can shift mindsets and we'll churn those deals because of it. Ramifications of myth 3. So myth 3 is that we should ask them qualifying questions on inbound. Number 1, you're likely disqualifying someone who could have bought. 2, your prospects feel devalued in the process. 3, at best, you get subjective answers in nature from your prospects, which subjective is never usually good. At worst, you get answers that aren't true. This is usually what happens, actually, from what I've seen. Qualifying questions are no value to your prospects. They truly aren't. They're what I'd call from them questions, which I go into in season 3, episode 1. Very long episode, but it means you're taking something from them at the expense of their time, their conversion on the back end, which would affect you, but they're no value to the prospect. And qualifying questions can offend your prospects. You'll often hear someone, if you say, are you the decision maker? They're like, they feel upset, disempowered, angry by the question. Ramifications of myth 4. Myth 4, as a reminder, is that you should ask them BANT questions. And number 1, it makes your unqualified prospects feel devalued. They raise their hand saying, I want to take a look at your product. And you're like, first, let me see if you're cool enough. Is the first thing you're leading out the gate with people who are cool enough and who aren't. Bad look for both, So prospects that aren't qualified today also could be qualified tomorrow. So if I'm asking if you're the decision maker today, or if you have a need today, or if your team is big enough today, and you say, no, I'm not, and you won't give me a demo, and then I go to another organization where I am qualified, my perspective of you is not going to change. My perspective is that I wasn't cool enough at one point, so screw you. I'm not gonna evaluate in the future. You'll see this a lot with CEOs actually that ask for funding from someone in the beginning. They wouldn't give it to them because they weren't good enough, and then I see this almost with every CEO. And then they make it, their company's successful. and they call out those VC companies. They're like, yo, so like they won't take a dime from them. And they're mad at them because they're like, you didn't think I was good enough and I was successful despite you. This is the user journey you're giving your prospects. It's like, hey, I was too good or I wasn't good enough to essentially even look at your product. And then I go to another organization that's valuable to you. Screw you. I don't want to talk to you. This damages your company brand more than you know. I'm thinking of a marquee example that basically, they called me and they said like, hey, I just went through this journey and validated each step of the gate. They were like, hey, I just felt like I wasn't cool every single time. So, it can damage your company brand, which you've worked so hard to achieve. And number 5, on a side note, you promise something you don't deliver. You encourage them to ask them to request a demo, and then they can't get a demo of your product. So myth number 5, and then we're going to close out here for the day. Myth number 5 is that they don't know what's going on when you're asking them qualifying questions. Number 1 here, and I'm going to try and not get heated. Prospects are aware. They're aware. I don't know how to tell it to you other than they just are. They know exactly what you're doing. When you're like, hey, can I ask you if you're the decision maker and if you have money so I can better gear your demo? It's like, for what? Why would you need to know that question? Number 2, prospects are a lot of time expecting a demo on the first call. And if they have a qualifying call with an SDR, they can start to get frustrated that all of a sudden they were expecting something and they didn't get it. So it's kind of like when you're expecting something to be water, but it was Coke instead, and you spit it out. You like Coke, but it wasn't what you were expecting in the moment. So point being, if they're expecting a demo and they don't get it, then they can often be mad. They have to answer questions that are low value to them. Once they finally are passed to the AE for the disco call, they often have to repeat the answers to the same terrible questions that they did in the beginning because the AE doesn't do the homework. And let's just for a second say that they do believe that the qualifying call that you had with them as with an SDR was a first call. Let's pretend for a second, just because I like to have fun, pretend that they do believe you. They're going to, which let me be very clear, they don't. But let's pretend for argument's sake they do. Then they're very freaking confused when on the next call, there's someone else on the call, that they're going through another discovery, right? Because you convinced them that the first one was a discovery. If they do believe it, but they don't. But if they do, it's even worse. And number 6, to close this out here, sometimes prospects bring their entire team to the first call. So they've got them and 6 other people that they brought to this call just to see a demo. And all of a sudden it's a SDR asking them if they're the decision maker. It's like, which one of us are you talking about? So I put, please just don't do it. But the ramifications impacts can be very, 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 very weighty on your organization. So in summary, I know that we're after the information on whether someone is qualified. I know that it's valuable information, but current state as is, I think asking BANT questions are I've seen it yield some of the most damaging impacts, not only on your brand, not only on your pipeline, but the conversion of that pipeline because of it. So there is a better way. I hope that this was helpful to present an option for inbound and outbound of where you can still get the same type of information, but convert your prospects at a 70% more rate because you're taking care of them along the way in terms of speed. So I hope this was helpful in those options, but I want to stress there is a better way, better for our prospects, better for us because of it, and better for everyone overall. Whew. So that is everything. Thanks so much for watching. If you like this session, you want to see more just like it, if you go to flipthescript.co, we have a number of different sessions on anything and everything sales. And if you really like this session, if you want to see minor tidbits throughout the week, if you go to Flip the Script on LinkedIn and give us a follow, because we put out tidbits about 3 times per week. But either way, I very much so appreciate you tuning in today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day prospecting.